So we handed out, we'll do a proper introduction of our panelists in just a moment. What we handed out is a mainstreaming conflict sensitivity little self-assessment. It's just for fun. We're going to take a little different approach to this session. We're going to start off with a little interactive discussion on mainstreaming conflict sensitivity, and then we'll move into some of our panelists giving us pointers in a Q&A. So on your worksheet, there's a little rating chart at the top, 1 being low, 5 being high. You can rate yourself in terms of what you think you practice on a daily basis, and then how you might rate your organization if you are affiliated with an organization. If you're an independent consultant, you can think about perhaps an organization that you work with on an ongoing basis. Okay? And think about how you would rate. If neither of those apply, just think about yourself then. Okay? You don't have to share this with anyone. This is personal. And then, what examples can you share where CS practices failed or succeeded? Wait, do we really not have any more?
Yeah, I handed out, I think, up till there. I think I handed out up to I left one.
Can I ask you, is it possible to make a few more copies? Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you.
I need one.
Let me give it to Sweta. We're making some more copies. Thank you so much. Yeah. I'm sorry, we're just going to make some more copies, but it depends on how they turn out, but it's a good thing. We'll just take about maybe 3 or 4 minutes to complete this, and then we're going to have some space for discussion. Hi, welcome. Yes, yes, we just need some more copies. Yeah, no worries. So I will bring one to you in a second. Okay, thank you.
Someone started to hand them out and then set them down.
I collected them from the back.
Oh, right. I was looking to see if I have my own copy, but I'm not seeing it. I switched bags this morning, which is always fatal. It's been that kind of day. I miss my boss. I like it. My father decided he was going to tag along, so of course that's why I missed the bus. Because he was like ready really early, and I was like, we don't have to go so early. I miss it. So we'll see how this goes. It'll just follow on a day.
Yes, I'm this. I love this.
Come on in, please have a seat. Okay, we did, I know a couple of you have trickled in the last few minutes. We do have a handout for you. There are additional copies being made. Sorry about that. We seem to have lost a small pile. So they are coming momentarily. In the meantime, I'd like to go ahead and just give you a quick introduction to our session today. As I mentioned, we're taking a little bit of a different approach to this panel. We want to make it both inclusive and participatory with all of you, because everyone in this audience brings their own experience in conflict sensitivity and peace building, and we also want to hear from you. So with that, thanks, Evan. Here are a couple more. Sure. If anyone else needs one, if you could just raise your hand and Evan will come around. Thanks, Evan. So after you finish that, what I'd like you to do is just get together with a couple of neighbors next to you and discuss where you think your greatest failures or successes are. Okay? Share any examples on your failures or successes in integrating conflict sensitivity. And up here, what are overlapping challenges your organizations have experienced or that you experience? Okay? So if you could just, if you're 3 or 4 people next to each other, please just go ahead and start those conversations. And for anyone who would like a quick reminder of what we mean by conflict sensitivity, here's what we mean by conflict sensitivity. A conflict-sensitive approach involves gaining a sound understanding of the two-way interaction between activities and the context, acting to minimize negative impacts and maximize positive impacts. Okay? And then here is what we mean by mainstreaming conflict sensitivity. Sorry, I'm messing up your... That's okay. I just turned it up 1 notch. For what it's worth. Okay. Did that work? Did you put it down? I'm not sure. Did you just... Okay. All right. I won't touch it.
Like blasting out the camera.
Okay, so then once they do this, I'm just going to do a panel introduction so that they know who they're speaking to up here. And then...
Are you introducing us, or you want us to introduce ourselves?
I have some notes. You're welcome to add.
That's
I see like 3 points on each of you.
No, that's
Fine. That's
Yeah.
fine.
And
Yeah.
then they have the full bios in their
Yeah.
app if they've downloaded that.
Yeah.
And then and then let's just start. I'll just start facilitating conversations.
Yep.
Facilitating the conversation,
Input,
but
yeah.
also drawing out some questions. And what I was going to do now is as they're talking, I think it was you mentioned to get them, or someone said to get them to write down questions on Post-its. Maybe that was your suggestion.
yeah. That's
Yeah, I'm not sure it's going to work.
no.
Yeah, I have Post-its in my bag, but I think
That's
it's
okay.
going to be too much interaction
Yep.
today.
Especially with the way it's set up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. That's
Yeah. Okay. So we'll just elicit the kind of key points up here. We can jot them down if we want to as we go, and then have a mole in the audience to transition us to the. Yeah.
Nice. Nice.
Just just to transition us to slides at 11:30, so we can focus on each organization
Fantastic.
as well.
Yeah.
Cool. That sounds great.
That's great. She's well prepared.
She does this for a living. Not the model.
No, it totally is. Yeah. No, it totally is.
Were you at the session that Ryan McCannell moderated yesterday? It was about the neuroscience of social behavior change. He was so funny. He was like, he just gave a whole like prelude. He's like, I understand you guys have a lot of things to say. I am not going to tolerate that. I want short, concise, and I'm going to designate each person to answer one question, and that's it.
Oh, interesting.
We did a long night.
Wow. Was it good?
Yeah, I thought so.
Okay. Well, that's cool. If it works, that's good. you
Yeah,
know?
Like he's got like a kind of funny like.
Right. It fits with.
But
Because it could be funny and flippant, or it could be like, ooh, abrasive.
Yeah.
and he was like, okay, what is your question?
Right. Right.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. Sure. Thank you. It's the second day, so we are kind of okay. Yeah, it's kind of we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
How did that go? And is it a huge fundraiser for your levels, or is it more about like marketing? Yeah. So you
It is interesting, yeah.
I think it works well in a way. Like, I mean, it is an odd layout, but I think that you have a huge room, and then you can have the breakout room. It's totally fine. Thanks again for your help.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. I think the whole setup should turn the other way.
I know.
Something like that.
Yeah.
So
But
we're
it's too
facing
much
that
work.
direction. You're right. That's more.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of work, right? Immediately to change this whole
Especially
setup.
because the other thing was late getting out. So.
Yeah. So it might not work either. Unless it's planned, well planned. And
Right, right.
It's changed quickly.
You have to turn all the chairs.
Yeah. Manpower. Are they really talking about conflict sensitivity or something else?
I know. I was actually wondering, like, this is
I
very
mean, it
energetic.
seems like
for
very
conflict
energetic.
sensitivity.
It cannot be.
I know. I've been wanting to meet you for months.
Anyway, yeah,
It's
let's see.
really interesting. They're doing a readout, right? Like they're gonna.
I think that's a plan. Yeah.
They're like, oh no, we were talking about the bar last. Great cocktail.
Did you hear about the
Because it's-
change of leadership in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, exactly. Sweta is on the corner, so she's definitely not into that conversation. But, yeah. And also, yeah, it's the second day, so last night would have been a lot of outings and gatherings, and it's still a good topic to discuss.
Yeah.
Phew.
this, I had like planned the whole week of like donor meetings. So those have been really interesting. I went to the special envoy, special representative's office for Sudan and South Sudan yesterday, and that was very interesting. But, no, totally. And I feel bad because I got to duck out later today for 2 more like outside meetings. But yeah, so unfortunately I missed it all.
There's some really interesting topics. I don't know.
I know,
Yeah,
yeah.
it was. And I really enjoyed the youth peace thing.
Okay.
It was nice.
It was good?
It was really good. And then.
For giving me your
Ah, no,
copy.
that's
You
fine.
don't need it? Okay. Anybody else? Do I need
Yeah, I think I
it?
do it.
I don't think so.
And I really enjoyed the dignity discussions.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
The dignity, peacebuilding, conflict resolution. Dignity matters. I still thought that it's a kind of a Western perspective, but I mean,
All right, so are we still talking about conflict sensitivity? Yeah?
Feeling is probably
Wonderful. Never know how the conversation
yeah, maybe
might
how
steer
it was
to.
framed. But I really enjoyed that.
All right, so let's bring this discussion up here to the front.
That was yesterday, that was the
Cut
first
your
session.
conversation
That was the
short.
first
I'm
Yeah.
so
And then the
enthralled
second I
that
went
all
into
of you are so engaged in these conversations and about this topic. So if anyone on the left-hand side would like to scoot over, we tried to get everyone here just because it was such a big room and make it a little bit more of an intimate conversation. There's a few of you who trickled in. I'll just reiterate quickly that we really wanted this session to be more participatory and inclusive of the audience and not just our experts up here chit-chatting and Q&A. We will have some of that, so not to despair. But this was just a nice jump start to start getting us really ingrained in the topic. So the first question, we had 2 questions up here. What overlapping challenges are your organizations experiencing in mainstreaming conflict sensitivity? And what examples can you share where conflict-sensitive practices succeeded or failed? Our panelists will also discuss these questions in a few minutes, but we wanted to give you the chance to also share them out loud because we don't get the opportunity to do that very often, especially in a forum like this where we're coming from all over the world. I'd like to quickly introduce our panel before we get started on eliciting your conversations. Hello. We have, I'll start from the left, your left. Ioli Filmaridis is from USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. She covers the Asia region for the most part, with little dabs of Africa recently. She's a peacebuilding and conflict advisor for CMM and has previously worked as a program officer in both Zimbabwe and Mongolia. And prior to USAID, she was with the Asia Foundation, helping them with strategic planning and partner engagement for various programs. So welcome, Yoli. And our next panelist is Dilshan Anaraj. He is based on the wonderful island of Sri Lanka, but joined us here today. He's with World Vision. He has been with World Vision for 16 plus years.
Yep.
Everyone up here has been with we're very loyal people at Vision. We all have above 15 years with our respective organizations. So Dilshan is joining us from Sri Lanka. He's been with World Vision. He is the Associate Director, make sure I get his title right, Associate Director for Peacebuilding. He's a regional person, so he doesn't only cover Sri Lanka, but the region including Afghanistan and others. And he also leads World Vision's Children, Youth, and Interfaith Peacebuilding portfolio. And next we have Rebecca Bassams. And Rebecca is with Search for Common Ground. She is the true definition of an Africa expert. She has been working on the continent of Africa in various regions for 17 years. She is currently the regional director for East Africa and based in Rwanda. She's focused on various regions, both West Africa, East Africa.
Just those 2.
Just those 2? Okay, all right. Her focus on conflict sensitivity comes from Search's Common Ground approach, which is a little teaser that you'll hear more about when we get to our discussion. All right. My name is Jennifer Ullman. I'm with MSI. Been conflict and peace building my whole career, from graduate school onwards, for about 17, 18 years now. I started off specifically on this topic of conflict sensitivity probably about a decade ago. I was trying to think of when did I actually start using this terminology. And probably about a decade ago in a proposal in East Africa, actually in Kenya, on a really interesting program with PACT. But more recently, I've been working with the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, CMM, in developing a course called Conflict Sensitive Aid. So it's the first course for the agency that actually focuses on how development professionals can integrate a conflict-sensitive lens into all their sectors, all their programming, no matter what it is, with hopes of course, achieving peace writ little or peace writ large. So with that, let's move to the audience. So going back to our first question on overlapping challenges that your organizations have been experiencing. The word overlapping was key here just to see if there's a couple of highlights that are collectively challenging for our organizations. Would anyone like to share something that came out of their conversation? Yes, please, thank you. Please.
Oh, okay. Well, Nick and I were actually having a conversation about the language, because his organization is pluralism. When I teach a course on this, we use shared societies, because we feel it's a simpler term understood, and we have developed an audit with the Club of Madrid. So the question around language, I think the other thing is a shared lens, as opposed to mainstreaming. So I just want to note that there are many different ways in which people are doing this work, but calling it different things for different reasons.
Thank you, thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, sir.
I would find it helpful if you could give a brief definition of conflict sensitivity.
Yes, sir.
And you turn to that.
So this is the definition that we collectively use. It comes out of the Conflict Sensitivity Consortium. So we take no credit for writing this. Well, actually, some of you in the room can take credit, I think. Yes, so this is generally the definition we use. So looking at conflict sensitivity, so ensuring that all programming is, whether it be a direct conflict program, whether it's a peace building program. This peace building programming doesn't necessarily mean that it's conflict sensitive, right? There are peace building programs that they are absolutely working towards peaceful means and with the right intention, but not always considering all the conflict dynamics of the people, of the geographic location, of the actual work that they're doing, the processes, the practices. Yeah. Is that sufficient for you? Okay. You had your hand raised, and then I'll come back.
This has really come out of our discussion, but something I brought into the discussion was that in my experience, the challenge in terms of organization versus project is that conflict sensitivity approaches require real focus on the power of the process for the organization with the value of the power of the product. And they really require very different investments of resources.
That's a good point. The power of the process versus the product. I like that. I might have to steal that.
Discussed a little bit too about how, it's difficult because institutions also aren't neutral. And so oftentimes if there's power imbalances or structural injustices within the organization trying to do conflict sensitivity, they may not be doing no harm within themselves, and then to suddenly kind of magically translate into that approach to projects is actually quite difficult. So there can be kind of a willingness to do it outside but not inside, but then of course that does it necessarily.
Yes, I don't know if anyone here has an example to share on an experience, but one experience that I can recall is where I was asked to come in to facilitate internal discussions. It was in Kosovo where, various ethnic groups were brought in to work for an NGO, international NGO, I'll leave them unnamed for now, but international NGO, and of course it was immediate post-conflict. They wanted to, they had to quickly hire were from various ethnic groups who still were in conflict, within, and had not dealt with that and found it very challenging to work together. And it was a peace building program, for youth. So I take that to heart. Anyone else would like to share an experience or? John.
A couple of things that came out of our group were kind of donor demand, if you will, and that many organizations are working for donors in various shapes and colors, and if the donor is not demanding it or even providing structure or a framework for it, then it may fall by the wayside. That's one. And then the second one is actually related very much to the first, is that it requires resources. In the same way mainstreaming gender across program requires resources and capacity of people to understand that. And if you don't have that in a project, the dollars, the time, the expertise, then again, it falls by the wayside. Maybe it peaks here, for a certain project that might demand that it have some extra resources, but overall it kind of may peter out.
Yeah. Thanks. I'm jotting down a couple of key topics, and then we'll take it to the panelists to respond to. Yes, sir.
Yeah, there was one very interesting experience from Pakistan when there was a flood in 2009, 2010. And the humanitarian expertise were in other parts of the country because of the 2015, 2005 earthquake in certain part of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So the advertisement for employment was carried out in 2010 by some even international organization, humanitarian organization, where they have write down they wanted driver, they wanted a low paid staff, and they said that the staff should know a language which was not of the language of the particular area where the intervention is supposed to be undertaken. So this also create a conflict where the locals they did demonstration, and because why you are even exporting travel from other regions, So also while you are doing some employment, so you should also keep these things done. The other thing was that in 2005 flood earthquake, some organizations, the offices, the flood. The flood was occurred in a very conservative way. So in some of the NGO staff, they used to live, in the same area. So afternoon they used to play, ping pong, badminton, and there was a co-sharing, the male and female staff was living in the same. Because I'm talking about the specific area. So it's also created problem. Because it was lack of understanding of the local culture.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last part, sir.
Lack of understanding of the local culture and local sensitivity.
Yeah.
So it also created a conflict.
Yes.
For lots of
Yes, and these are absolutely, thank you for sharing those very key examples. And whether the hiring, going back to your comments about processes versus product, the processes, the practices that we use in our hiring mechanisms, in our everyday decision making, all need to be done with that conflict-sensitive lens to the people, to the place, to the context. It's all involved, and I thank you for those comments. Please.
So I guess it's on the same line about resources and capacity.
Okay.
So I think also one of the key point is like how much is negotiable and like what's the limit. For instance, when we talk about recruitment, right? Conflict sensitive approach in certain contexts might be, for instance, like going for a local recruitment, right? But what if there are local husbands?
take one more comment, and then we'll have our panelists respond to some of these.
Coming from a bit of a bigger organization, I think one of our challenges is that we have the right tools and policies and conflict sensitivity is written into our response strategies and that sort of thing, but how it translates to our really local level staff who are interacting with the communities and making sure that they have the chance to sort of process their own experience of being people who have participated or been impacted by the conflict, but then also sort of giving them the tools to really, have a conflict sensitive approach. And we have a lot of really great senior expat leaders who can sit in the capital city and talk about conflict sensitivity, but then may not impact how we're doing food distributions of these rural areas.
Thank you for sharing that. I see a lot of nodding heads, including myself, coming from a large organization where we try to practice it on a daily basis, but it doesn't necessarily reach out always to the people who really need it. So thank you. We're going to pause there for a moment and let our panelists respond to some of these concerns, and then we'll continue with the second question as well. Yoli, Dilshan, Rebecca, obviously Yoli is representing USAID as an agency, as a donor, so some of these questions are pertinent to her about, going to Jerome's point about if the donor doesn't ask for it, how do we integrate it? It's a really key question, I think, that we'll ask Yoli to respond to in a second. And then the resources and capacities. I think all three of our panelists can respond to the resources and capacities for integrating conflict sensitivity. How do you, figure out the money even within your own budget, even if it's an intentional part of your design? How what is the money that has to go to conflict sensitivity? Is it separate? Is it integrated? Another key question. There was a comment on policies. I might be stretching what was said a little bit with my own bias, admittedly. But if anyone wants to respond to also that policy, discussion, and even if it's not policy, like the, donors, I don't think, please correct me if I'm mistaken, I don't think there's a major donor out there that has a policy on conflict sensitivity. There's guidance. I'm not sure there's a policy. So guidance is a starting point, right? But how do
Or maybe it was the organizational policies.
And the organization's policies as well, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And then, finally, there were several of you commented on not only translating it to the local staff, but also hiring those local staff with those capacities. So kind of a staffing and recruitment question as well. Ilya, can we start with you on the
donor piece?
Yeah.
So I can give some thoughts, and I'm going to flip it around and give a little story about we were doing a mainstreaming conflict sensitivity session with some implementing partners in Burma a few months ago, and one of the implementing partners said, well, if you just tell us to do it, we'll do it. Like they were so hungry for the information, and they wanted to know what could be done, but I think, and this is one of the challenges that I will speak to, and I might as well talk about it now, is that USAID structures and bureaucracy make it so difficult sometimes for partners to be creative, for them to really engage on the issues that they see as relevant. But I think it's part of a process of building awareness among everybody, donors and partners alike, to say, okay, well, if it's not part of the scope of work, why don't we bring it up? Why don't we start to talk about it? Why don't we talk about how effective it could be? Because what we're all trying to achieve is the objectives and goals that we want, which is, better development. And if you start making that point, you start having that conversation, if you find people who are more flexible in the way they approach their scopes of works and their implementation, they can add it in. There are ways to adapt and be more flexible that we're trying to work on within USAID and I think a lot of other donors. So those are a few suggestions that come to mind right away.
Thank you. Any other questions on that particular topic?
I would love to make a comment,
Yeah,
if that's
please,
okay.
Rebecca.
Sure. This is maybe coming from the other perspective on it, but I have promised my colleagues that whenever I'm in a place where advocacy is possible, I would bring it up. And I think there's the flip side of the conflict sensitivity work and the policies, which is U.S. government policies and other policies that prevent us from working with certain actors in the conflict. And how do you do conflict-sensitive programming on a certain thing when certain people can't be in the room? And So there's this really serious contrast between what we say we want to do, and then you got your finance arm going like, not those people, you know? And I think that is a reality that we work in that we don't necessarily acknowledge enough. And then particularly when you take that to local partners and you take that to local staff, and they're saying, but you know, the key actors are, I'll take a historical example, M23 in the DRC, but you can't have anybody that represents that armed group in the conflict because they're on the watch list. And how do we handle that dynamic in a conflict-sensitive way that also doesn't get all of our funding pulled? Because I think people know also Norwegian People's Aid and their situation, so now it's really in the face of Peacebuilders, what can you do in the threat that's there? So I promised I will bring that up and just kind of throw it out there. But I think that's a really key aspect of the work that just undermines a lot of the things that we're trying to do on kind of the programmatic side.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, sorry.
Dilshan, do you want to talk about policies?
No, maybe I can go into the capacity thing.
Sure.
Basically, I think for all organizations, most of the organizations, our organization's capacity is a serious issue. Because mostly either it's a project-based for 1 or 2 years, and then the staff come in, then the staff go out. But I think one of the things that we have tried doing in the past is to make sure that how do our orientation programs build in these kind of capacity gaps on conflict sensitivity. As they come in, how do we have conflict sensitivity also built into the orientation package? But also, do we have a continuous capacity building mechanism within the organization? Could be online. I don't think we can afford a lot of face-to-faces now, but at least to have these online training courses organizationally, internally, plus also we do have a lot of external sources. So those are some of the things that we are trying to address within the organization. But also a good example is the network and the hubs that we have, the global the CS consortium we had, and the hub that we have now, where we get support from the others, training packages, training events coming up, free of charge certain instances. So I think those are some of the good opportunities for us to really think of this.
Yes, please.
Could you speak up a little bit? Sorry, because we're
Yeah.
speaking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Should we just stand? Yeah. I think it's easier.
enough.
We get more eye contact too.
I
It's
know.
such an awkward setup. Yeah. Rebecca, do you have anything else on capacity from Search for Common Ground that you'd like to talk about?
I could talk for hours, so I'll try to keep it short. But I mean, I would completely echo what you say. Within Search, one of the things we struggle to do is try to keep a consistent group of staff, because ideally a lot of time goes into training them, preparing them, but it also means you're sort of in this constant, like, well, now you'll work on this project, well, now you can go over here, et cetera. But I think the other aspect of it is that in a lot of ways, conflict sensitivity, conflict analysis, reflective learning, all those aspects of it, they also take time. And so maybe you've got your 18-month project or your 12 months of funding, and conflict analysis isn't something you just did when you wrote the proposal, and then things, I mean, they're dynamic contexts. So how do you then take a pause, make sure you have the people in the room, do the reflection, apply it? And I think often, I get very focused on like the practicalities of how these things happen, and so often that gets missed, because then you're behind on this or behind on that, or you do hire new staff, but you need 2 months for them really to get it before you really trust them to kind of go out and manage it, and what are the results going to be. So I think that staff investment's so important, and then as you said, if it's a short-term engagement with the staff, then what's the kind of the cost-benefit analysis? So how do you balance those different pieces?
Maybe just one follow-up point, if anybody has, I'm familiar with Sri Lanka, where CHA, for a period of time, maybe a decade or so, really pushed conflict sensitivity locally. That's kind of petered out a little bit. But any other examples that people have, I think that was very valuable in the Sri Lankan context, but it's rare. I don't know any other countries that have a local organization that has worked over a period of time to kind of build local capacity on conflict sensitivity. So if anybody has examples of that, that would be great.
Just to preempt, a few years ago I worked with authors, leaders in the field on conflict sensitivity in issues like health, business, governance, security forces, education. 6 examples in each of their chapters, which range from WHO, have a great Health for Peace process ongoing. There was one I loved in Malaysia where there are 3 different ethnic groups who don't want to combine into integrated education, so they actually get a similar space with 3 different schools, so playground, eating, etc. And in my own country, Northern Ireland, this is actually by law. Conflict sensitivity work is by law in any agency that gets public funding. So every local community council has to show how every one of its programs contributes towards shared society. I think it's called Shared Futures, but it's basically conflict sensitivity. So I just want to bring that into the room because there is a lot of it going on, and I think we just haven't been sharing. And there is a book on it, which I edited. What's it called? Public Policies for Shared Societies. You can probably find it on the web. But there is a lot going on. I think it's not, people aren't coming together enough to actually share their experiences.
Great, thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, Ron Fisher from American University. Most of my experience has been bilateral ethno-political conflicts and with processes like problem-solving workshops or dialogue, where you work to develop through joint conflict analysis conflict sensitivity in the minds and the hearts of people from the 2 contending groups. So when you go into a situation like that and you're working with people who are participants in the conflict and have their perspective, their analysis, etc., it seems to me the real challenge in joint analysis and thinking is getting people on one side to be able to be sensitive to the needs, concerns, and constraints on the other side so that before they act, they take those into account. This is not an easy thing, so I appreciate some comments on how you work to achieve that among local staff to the point that they can not do stupid things. That's quite problematic.
Ever start? I mean, I know within Search we spend a lot of time focusing on humanizing the other, and that's kind of how he frame it. And some of it, I mean, it's something that we do as a programmatic thing, but at least within the region that I work on, we also have a lot of conversations about it within the office. And so, for example, our staff in South Sudan, in the violence that broke out in, I'm really bad at dates, but I think it was July 2016. You know, they came to Kampala. We were working out of another Search office in Kampala, and one of the big conversations we were having was about how they were reflecting on the experience they had having to evacuate and how they were perceiving the other actors. And, you know, these are hired as peace builders, et cetera, and there's conversations about, well, those guys are just devils, you don't understand, et cetera. And really trying to, but like, what do you think their interest is? And what do you think they look like? And what do you think, and really trying to make sure we spend time on it in the house as well as we do it outwards. I know I lived in Liberia before that, and it was another big conversation because we brought into the studio staff 3 people who reflected the 3 different armed groups. So people who represented Taylor, LURD, and then, I'm sorry, it's been too long, so the other group. I've switched out of that for a while. But they were talking about within their experience how for the first 3 to 6 months they were ostracized within the office because, okay, they're peace builders, but they're civil society peace builders. And there's, you know, good people and bad people, and how it took time to build relationships in the office so that they would greet each other and so that they would get over, because of course people experience the conflict themselves and they have their grievances. So I think they're definitely, too often we overlook it within our own staff and our own organizations before we go out and start doing programming. But it goes again to the time and the investment, which you can't show in your donor report. You know, nobody wants to see, well, we had 3 internal meetings to build team building. You know, that's not a product, as you had said before. You know, it's not really, it's a step in a process. It's not a product. So.
Thank you. Anything to add?
I mean, just to answer your question of, in Sri Lanka it was really a great momentum, organizations coming together. But I wouldn't say that it's lost. I mean, there are still individuals who are really working on it.
That's my point.
Exactly.
That run, even though it hasn't been done recently, there's still a pool of great people who know civil society, who know local context, and who understand the broader conflict sensitivity. And that's the perfect, it's a perfect setup, because conflict sensitivity is so contextualized, even more so than maybe gender or other things. You really need to know the nitty-gritty to kind of be able to make it functional.
Now, just to add to that, I was going to say that we do have in few other countries as well. I have seen, like in Myanmar, CD initiated that. Though sometimes it's driven by international communities, but then I see a lot of local level organizations running it. I see that in South Sudan, I see that in Kenya. Yeah, I mean, it's growing. That network is really growing. It's really nice.
Oh, I was thinking about
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
but I wanted to kind of follow up on the comment that you made because it brought something to mind to me as an educator dealing with students and training, and not so much in conflict sensitivity, but in peace building. The mental models that people, when you say conflict sensitivity, to many people they kind of put it in the same realm with things like trauma-informed care, that you have to kind of be aware of this to kind of not, avoid triggers and things of that sort. When in fact, I find more productive with them is taking more of the community building, community organizing sensitivity, like with Scott Peck, with, it takes friction to make a smooth surface, to engage sort of the conflict as a creative process to build awareness of each other's needs. So I think that's just one of the things that came to mind in this conversation.
Thank you very much. Carrie and then Swetha.
Just build on those same points that I'm Carrie Grunlow from USAID, and I was the conflict advisor in South Sudan. And first of all, I developed a three-part approach because I got out there and we were really very focused on applying the tools that are out there, particularly from CDA, to programs. And so that had to be built out into what I call the three Ps: people, processes, and programs. Because the people had, nobody knew what it was, the skills weren't there, but more importantly, the relationships were broken. And so there were these biases, and there were biases built on very painful, very real experiences on both sides. And so that had to be acknowledged, and it needed to be done in a very explicit, not an implicit manner to facilitate those discussions that you're talking about, and that takes time. Sort of recognizing that in every conflict there are multiple truths, and we're not asking you to drop your truth, but you have to get to a place where you can acknowledge the other truths in the room. And so that was a big part of it. And then the other piece, linking back to what this gentleman just said, is that part of our solution too was organizing a series of sessions for our staff, and our peace building program staff was doing this as well, in trauma awareness and sort of basic techniques to deal with these physical and psychological impacts of trauma, because that was also sort of fueling some of the us versus them narratives, and that those people and the anger and the revenge seeking and desire for revenge that was getting in the way of those relationships that we needed to work. And it's not easy, and it takes a really long time. So that's what we learned. 3 Ps, not just one.
Thank you, Carrie. Swetha.
Swetha from CDA Collaborative Learning Projects. We're talking about staffing and, after a protracted conflict, how do you manage those dimensions? We work a lot with organizations that are trying to apply conflict sensitivity, and time again, we've seen really good examples of where actually frontline staff do notice that their intervention, their programs, their activities are actually doing
discussion. It's just slow baby steps, right? I do see a bit of it, and I'd like to hear if there's any other comments, either from the three of you or from the room on the incentivizing topic in particular. I'm sorry.
Mary Fitzstuff from Brandeis University. One of the difficulties is to do this with staff. It's like opening a Pandora's box, because in many situations, people who are undertaking local programming are actually staying pretty quiet about where they are on the political scene, and it does raise questions about justice, about identity, about who belongs, who doesn't. So it's not an easy thing, and I would suspect that is preventing a lot of people from even beginning to address it. I know from my own experience of trying to address it in few conflicts, this is something that people have rarely been open about. They've never said where they come from. They've never said what they think about things. So you're asking people for whom the normal work that research would do to do it, and they've had absolutely no experience, no training, and they're often afraid. And I think that's one thing that we really have to recognize. You need people who are comfortable with handling those conversations within every institution to actually move this work forward.
Thank you very much.
I was just going to comment that I think there's also a disincentive to be honestly reflective of a project and say, this wasn't as effective and here's why. We didn't do this sufficiently at the beginning. We didn't do the planning and preparation to lay the appropriate groundwork in a conflict-sensitive manner for this to be successful. And if there can be a way to allow people that space, then a funder might hear, well, gee, well, why didn't we give you that opportunity? And we need to change the model so that we actually consider planning and preparation as the most important piece of the work.
Yeah, so my question for all of you would be about, is there any collective action that has been taken by a consortium in terms of mainstreaming conflict sensitivities along the different organizations, or like steps or phases of the project? Because, for instance, we're seeing this happening, especially when we have, when like same organizations work in the same areas, or different organizations, work in the same areas, or like during consortium groups where the policies of the organizations are different. So what one organization mean for conflict sensitivity might not be exactly the same thing that some other mean, and so we do create conflict within, unwanted conflict in the communities where we work. And again, it could be like the way we do research. For instance, like one organization collects information and pays the community to come for the focus group, the other one doesn't, creates conflict in the communities. Or, for instance, I don't know, like one organization goes back to the communities and give back the results of the data they're collecting, and the other one doesn't, and it still creates conflict within the community. So my questions in brief is like, is there any collective action that the consortium is doing in terms of clarifying how to integrate conflict sensitivities in the different steps of the project cycle, but also of the organizations, in order to also harmonize the different approaches that are happening in the field to make sure that we are conflict sensitive?
I have a short response to that, but does anyone from the audience want to respond to any of the work that they might be doing to build that collective thinking? Not yet? Okay. Well, this is a little bit of a plug, so apologies. But with Alliance for Peacebuilding, we are going to be starting a working group on conflict sensitivity that will allow such discussions. I will be co-chairing that with others. We're still figuring out the details, but we will ask you to write down your email if that sounds of interest to you before you leave the room today, and we'd like to directly follow up with anyone interested in participating, leading, what have you, that working group. So thanks for giving me that opportunity. Mark and then Swetha. Did you have a hand up?
No, but I'll talk.
Okay. The floor is yours.
This is billed as a new wave, and one of the things that I'd like to see in the new wave is the connection between conflict sensitivity and relevance. I think they're different, but they're closely related. I think one comes before the other. I think
so I can send it to you and you can give it to me.
That would be lovely. Thank you. Sweta.
This is going to sound like a plug again, so I apologize for that. But because you're asking for, coming together, the work in South Sudan that I was referencing earlier is it's by consortium between CDA, Second World, and Swiss Peace. So it's three organizations coming together, having a shared understanding of conflict sensitivity, and it is very much South Sudan specific. So if everything's open source, you can find resources online. I'm also interested in, because the conversation is about an square, and something that we've personally been grappling with is metrics. How do we measure conflict sensitivity? And as CDA, we've been doing this for a while, and we haven't still cracked it. So I'm keen to hear what is the collective ideas on that? How do we begin to measure in a sensible way that doesn't go down the rabbit hole of spreadsheets and
I actually think that's a great point. It was something I was thinking about as I was thinking about what I was going to talk about is how do we prove this, right? Colleague said to me the other day, like, how do we prove that we're preventing conflict, that conflict didn't happen because of what we did? So when we talk about incentivizing, how do we need an evidence base to say this is your incentive, this is what we did by integrating conflict sensitivity. I don't have an answer to it, but I think a lot of people are probably thinking about it, and it's a groundswell, it's a movement. There's so many sessions that I've been to over the last couple of days, there's this evidence base that we're all missing, right? And so we're thinking about, you've got some fabulous minds coming together, and I think it's just like pushing the conversation, trying it, being open to failure and risk, which we've talked about. It sounds trite, but I think we have to put it into practice.
Hear, 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 hear. Do you, I know the incentives question and disincentives came up, particularly in relation to donors. Can I tap you to respond to that a little bit more, Yuli?
Yeah, so it's hard to think of it as incentivizing, but within CMM, we do a lot of work with colleagues in other offices and other missions, and part of our job is to highlight and incorporate and imbue this idea of conflict sensitivity, do no harm. So when they ask us to review their project proposals or be part of a technical evaluation committee, our primary role is to bring that lens in. So we get people thinking about it. We review the partner staffing, like the key people, what their approaches are, and we say, wait, they're missing this, this, and this. So I don't think of it as incentivizing, but it is kind of saying this is what we're working towards and getting our missions to think about it, who then kind of put it onto the partners and the proposals and the tenders to kind of, again, bring that into their own work.
Thank you. And this might be a nice segue, actually, to move into a few of the other approaches from our respective panelists and their organizations and how they are integrating conflict sensitivity across the organization and some of the failures, whether it be metrics in particular. I know that's a real challenge for all of us. I think part of that is the lack of guidance and lack of requirement to measure it, right? If you're, as a organization, often if we're not being asked to do it by the people who are providing the funds, we're not doing it we're not necessarily measuring it in a direct manner. Certainly we're looking at it because we're all in this room sensitive to the topic and the need for it, but we're not necessarily capturing it so that it becomes actual evidence and learning to move that forward. So thank you for raising that, Sweta. So I'd like to move into just a couple of slides that talk more specifically about each of our panelists' approach, both World Vision and Searching on the Ground, as well as USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. So I'll just ask each panelist to maybe stand. Dilshan's going to start us off. The floor is yours.
Okay, so just 2 slides I'll be rushing through. But for this, the content that I'm going to talk is based mostly on one of our internal research that we did, organizational wide, on measuring our conflict sensitivity efforts. And that's how we really went into our challenges and best practices kind of work. So as I go through the approaches and mainstreaming approaches for our organization, I'll be basically bringing in a lot of information from our study. We have washed our dirty clothes in many forums in the past after that initial research. And it was really done with the help of CDA. Technically, they provide us the technical research capacity to do this research within the organization. Based on our reports for the past 5-6 years, plus staff interviews, etc., etc. So our approach, World Vision's approach to conflict sensitivity is starting from, I mean, I'm following the same definitional approach to this as well. An in-depth context and conflict assessment, that's our key thing. One of the things that we also noticed is that the organization for the past few years thought conflict sensitivity is just context analysis. And that was a huge barrier for us to break through. And I would say that we kind of broke that over the past 2 years to actually tell the organization, and as an organization, for us to realize that conflict sensitivity is much more than context or conflict analysis. So, but still, that's our first point. And are we doing that right? That was our biggest questions. So we basically have a lot of tools, micro-level tools, starting from do no harm to other macro-level tools, interagency and internal to us as well. So I'm a bit happy on how we are performing at that level, understanding the context and conflict. But here comes the problem, the next level. So the second approach that we are trying to really focus is bringing that context data into the designing process. Otherwise, it's a waste of time, money. When I say bringing that into the designing process, it's really bringing that into the objectives, outputs, plus also the whole risk and indicator question of the whole monitoring. At this point in time, I'm not talking about monitoring the conflict sensitivity of the organization. It's basically monitoring the context, starting from the context monitoring process, because gradually we learned that we have outcome indicators against the sectors, but we don't have context monitoring indicators captured into the log frames or the whole design, because it gets into the risks or assessments and then sometimes it gets neglected. So we really wanted to work on that, but unfortunately that's something that we are still working on, and we are trying to get some support from other consortium and partners. Then after the context monitoring processes, it's the evaluations, midterm and end-term evaluations, and how well can we capture the whole conflict sensitivity aspects into those evaluations. What happens is mostly we are kind of stuck into the indicators that are in the log frame when it comes to the evaluations. Of course, there are development evaluation systems where we can really capture the conflict sensitivity aspects. But within the organization, that's really a biggest challenge, and that's something that we are trying to really address through other organizations. Let me go into the then the last point is the organizational functions and the conflict sensitivity. I mean, a lot of experts, conflict sensitivity experts, would say that it's automatically built into the projects. When we do construction of schools, buildings, or when we distribute food, we ask all these questions: where do we do this, with whom, by whom, for whom, all the do no harm questions. And then we automatically get that answers. For example, when I say organizational functions, I say recruitments or procurement processes. Obviously, we ask this question when we do the food distribution. Who are we with, or to exactly who are we doing this with? But what we saw that was sometimes we need to really take these functions out and really analyze in depth. How are we doing our recruitments in a special way so that we are cautious about ethnicity in that context, or gender, or faith, affiliations, etc. So that is something that we are trying to really focus, because that has become our security concern as well in most of the cases. So this is where we are trying to bring in the security perspectives into the do no harm, conflict sensitivity kind of discussions as well, which takes me to the next question of organizational buy-in. Sometimes we see that when we bring the security perspectives into the conflict sensitivity perspectives, sometimes the organizations quickly buy that in, because it's much more closer to the hearts of the management organizations, the functions. So when I say mainstreaming conflict sensitivity into the organizations, once again, all the bullet points here are against the challenges that we already foresaw and trying to address those challenges. So conflict sensitivity in national strategies means, for me, it's the policy level discussions. How do we make sure that conflict sensitivity, the notion of conflict sensitivity is brought into the management processes, in policies and practices, in core documents and guidances, so that it's not because of the donors, or it's not because of we had a security incident, we are integrating conflict sensitivity into the process, but we are mandated as from the top to the bottom that we have to have that lens. So that's something that we found, that there is a huge gap within the organization, and that's how we are trying to at least address that process. But then again, the question is, just because we have all these things in the guidelines, as Erica also mentioned, it doesn't really mean that the day-to-day life of the staff changes, or whether they're asking those why, what, where, and when that question on a day-to-day basis. Guidelines on sector-specific and non-sector specific. Now, this is a bit of a challenge for us, because initially we thought conflict sensitivities, those are the basic principles. It doesn't really matter whether you are on a peacebuilding field, or whether you are doing food distribution, whether you are doing health and nutrition or economic development. We thought that the basic principles are the same. You ask the same questions, the same process. But it seems there was a huge organizational pressure for us, sometimes from the external as well, to say that it differs from project to project, or sector to sector, or the work that we do. And they really wanted to have specific examples from those sectors. Like for the food distribution, they wanted like food-specific examples, so that they could really understand how to change why, what, where in a food distribution, as opposed to in health and nutrition, where you build your latrines. They needed to have specific examples and guidelines on how do you change where you build your latrines, and how do you choose your beneficiaries. So this is a new challenge for us, but we are trying to work on this. And I do see that there are a few other organizations who have already worked on it, and there are some other consortiums and networks who are really helping us on this process as well. Documentation, this came up, so I'm not going to talk a lot on that, but specifically we started doing a lot of case studies, starting from the very field level, not very upper level. But then with this notion of do no harm, when we go into the field to have these case studies, stories taken in, they always come up with, okay, this is how we did the recruitment, this is how it went wrong, and this is how we changed, and this is what happened. But we never get this story of positivity, of like, this is how we did the recruitment, and this is because we did the recruitment right, the project went right. We don't have evidence for that. And this is something that we are really seeking to understand, to get those evidences, so that there is proof for us to say that those decisions made at those field level really made this change come true. So that's a challenge for us. We do have a lot of case studies from how negative perspectives change into a positive aspect. But what we are really chasing behind is to get this, how positive decision making really helped, not getting into a do no harm issue or something like that. Last 3 points, support from friends. This is something that we really rely on. Those consortiums, South Sudan, the consortium in South Sudan, we really get out of a lot of things out of it. Though we are not part of that process, we are part of a global conflict sensitivity hub, trying to lead that process, and that's where we really get the motivation. which we didn't have few years back. And also like starting from the Sri Lankan consortiums, the Kenyan consortiums, the Myanmar consortiums, and that's where we really rely on information, not only information, but also the support and kind of push for us to really go in that direction. Tools. We are trying to build into different kinds of tools so that we can answer that demand from different levels, micro level, do no harm, but also other tools that could help us understanding the macro context and meso context. And the continuous self-assessment. This is something that we learned and we are trying to really do. It's not a one-time quick assessment of ourselves of how we are performing, but also to be part of other consortiums, partners to really see how well we are performing. And that's an area that we really need help with, and that's something that we are really expecting as well. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dilshan. Thank you very much. And we're going to pass it to Ioli for a few minutes.
Is that the clicker?
Thank you. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
All right, I'm going to touch on a few points from CMM's perspective. It will not be very deep, but if we want to talk about these things later, that's fine. So CMM, as I mentioned, our primary role is to kind of bring this conflict lens to what we're doing at USAID with our partners. We have amazing staff on board, myself not included, but we do have some great people that have done really good work. They've done great technical briefs, they've done training, they've done conflict assessments, and this is part of the toolkit that we use. Jen mentioned conflict-sensitive aid, which is a 4-day course. We offer it to our missions worldwide, as well as staff in DC. We've also developed a 3-day practicum, which I think it's really exciting. I think that it has a lot of potential, but basically we take the theories and toolkits that we present in CSA, and we give the missions the opportunity to bring those into their everyday work. So whether they're working on a project design, an evaluation, or a scope of work, we give them 3 days, we sit down with them, and we facilitate discussions around the do no harm conflict context that they're working in. We do a quick and dirty conflict analysis, and then we kind of like massage this into a presentation that they give to the mission leadership and their staff and colleagues. And this is part of our mainstreaming effort as well. The checklist that you guys worked on when you first came in, that's part of our CSA course. And I'll tell you, when I first did that, when I took the course, I realized that the missions I worked at were not on board. So it's a process, again. I mean, that's one of the challenges that we'll get to. Consultations, I mentioned that as well. I'm going to skip to challenges and go back to opportunities. So in terms of attitudes, I think this is something that we all look at with our work, whether it's towards conflict, the other identity groups. I think there is an attitude shift that needs to take place at USAID. I think we're so overburdened by the bureaucracy, and we have such limited time to think about not just conflict sensitivity, but monitoring and policies and laws and regulations. Our staff are completely overburdened, both in DC and the mission. I've seen both. So it's this attitude of acceptance, of awareness, of showing them the evidence base that it works. Another challenge is giving people agency, empowering them, as we've talked about. And this comes both from the leadership perspective, to have leaders that are on board with this. I was kind of amazed during the multinational corporations discussion on Tuesday or Wednesday it was, when the woman from LexisNexis talked about how her leadership said, this is the way we're going to do business from now on. And it just kind of, they went with it. And it's still a process, but they have been, the way she presented it was, they've really been making huge strides in their approaches to peace building and conflict sensitivity. So I think that's what we need. We have a few of those people at AID, but we need more. And there's urgency. Again, when you have so much work to do, everything has to be done yesterday, you're working on briefs and technical papers, you're going to the NSC, there's always a sense of urgency, and then to bring in this additional layer, which takes time and resources, it's very difficult. And finally, transitions. In the field, we have our American staff who transition every year, every 2 years, 3 years, 4 years if you're lucky. So you have this constant cycle of people coming in, learning the context, and then leaving with it, right? And you have to start that process all over again. So a response to this is you build up that capacity with your local staff. They're there, they know the context, they can talk to you about the risks and opportunities on the ground. They're a constant monitoring mechanism. The risk in that is that who are you hiring and how are they representing the conflict within the office? So there's a balance to these approaches. Going back to opportunities, so I'm relatively new to the conflict-sensitive world, but I have been, our mission, and this goes back to the leadership question, was one of like the first adopters of this collaborative learning adaptation approach. And she really pushed it, and we had to take it on. And being in the program office, we kind of had to work with our offices, our colleagues, and they were so resistant to it. But now there's not even, people kind of accept it as de facto. You're going to do CLA. And I see CS in the same way. I think the two are very complementary. I think that you are constantly learning and adapting in a conflict setting, and you have to collaborate, right? And we need to do that with our donors. We need to do that with each other, our partners, staff and relationships. I think a lot of times we are able to bring in the conflict sensitivity just by having a friend in a mission or an office, and they're like, hey, what are you doing now? And you start telling them, and they say, oh, that sounds great. We want to do that with you. So I think building those relationships and working in that context is really helpful. Successes, I'm going to mention a few, but I think we have Carrie here. I'm going to put her on the spot. She has great examples from South Sudan that she can talk about as well, and she's been in CMM much longer than I have. We have been building awareness and acceptance through those opportunities that I mentioned. Small steps in terms of the institutionalization of conflict sensitivity, bringing the CS8 in, having those processes and tools and bringing it in. I think a small step was integrating conflict analysis as a recommended analysis in our regulations. It's not a big one, but it's something that people are like, oh, what is that? How do we do it? Who do we talk to about it? And then the legacy. Again, our staff have a legacy. They're well respected within USAID, and they know who to turn to. So you build on those experts, and you bring in new people, and you develop that. I think the idea that conflict, fragility, instability, all these issues are being put in front of everyone now, and everyone's really taking these more seriously. That also gives us an opportunity to develop the language and the awareness around it. So that's the USAID quick perspective. But
thank you. And I know that some of you are packing up. I do want to let you know that AFP has extended this session by a few minutes to account for the late start. So you will not miss anything for lunch. I understand you might have had a pre-scheduled appointment. We apologize for that. But we hope we don't lose you. Rebecca is going to give us some nuggets from Search for Common Ground.
No problem. And it's always really challenging, I think, to prepare for a panel because you have no idea who's going to be in the room. And so you may come and, it's 20 interns who have never heard of Search, or you walk in and you find 5 former colleagues and 3 current colleagues, et cetera. So I may actually skip a lot of the sort of background information because I feel like pretty much everybody in here knows Search and what we do. I think the only thing I would mention on there is just, I think I bring a bit of a jaded perspective to conflict sensitivity because in a lot of ways it's the basis of all of the work that we do. So sometimes I forget that it's not that way for other organizations. But I would also say for people who do evaluation, I might be the perfect test case because I almost never come to this kind of event living overseas. And the discussion and the understanding, the acceptance of it has changed from when I lived in DC in 2004 to joining this conference now. It's significant, and I haven't been really along the process, so it's something I think to notice. I might turn the name of the panel a little bit on its head, and rather than being the next wave of conflict sensitivity, maybe the next wave of challenges. Because I think there's a lot of developed material, the training materials you were talking about, the checklists, and that's fantastic. And I think a lot of organizations have taken it on to varying degrees. But there's also new challenges and new opportunities where we haven't necessarily developed. And at the risk of sort of showing all of our flaws or what, but I'll just share an example from this morning where I get a text from my Kenyan colleague. We've been doing a workshop for the past 2 days with young people at risk for recruitment into Al-Shabaab. And we've been really trying to make sure we get the most relevant people, we get the people, like what are the real indicators? We're not just talking about young people, we're not just talking about unemployed young people, et cetera. But then this morning, national security has set up a checkpoint 2 blocks down from our road because they know we've got those people in our office in a safe space. How do we protect those people? How do we operate in a way that's appropriate with the law, but also reach the people that we're trying to reach? And what are the dynamics between them? We did get them out safely, and they didn't know why the rain suddenly became a really good reason that we needed to end early. But it's a real risk, I think, within some of the work that we're doing. So violent extremism, I think, is a big one, between the risk of engaging the right people and the risk of helping security prevent recruitment and things. I think another one that comes to mind, as it now slips right back out of my mind. Shoot, I'll come back to it because it literally just left me. But the one that I was going to share originally was also about Rwanda, where, 20 years on, a lot of work's been done on reconciliation. In some ways, everybody's very conflict sensitive. But one of the main conflict areas is governance. And how do you work on governance in a country with no opposition parties, really, with 97% election of the president, that type of thing? And that's where I was going with it. How do you work in a conflict-sensitive way when the government controls what you do to a degree or another? And how do you keep your operational protection and do the things that you need to do to be able to operate and still be conflict-sensitive? So in Rwanda, how do you operate within the context of a repressive government in a way that reflects what you want? So within our office, as long as no one reports me, we do ethnic-based hiring. But we would never say that we do ethnic-based hiring, and we have to be very, very careful how we do it. But it's really important that the office reflects the community. And how do you balance that? In Burundi right now, all NGOs have been deregistered over a similar question. And how do you manage it? How do you satisfy what the government wants? On this question, we're okay. But what if it was a different question? What if it was you had to only hire people from a political party or another? And how do you work? And at least within East Africa, governments are becoming more and more repressive, and the space is becoming more and more controlled. How do you do conflict-sensitive programming within those dynamics? And are we contextualizing some of the guidance that we give enough to recognize those realities, where you're not necessarily at liberty to make all the choices you want, whether it be the national government you're working under, the funder that you're working under with all of their things, or just the reality of your organization and having to have 3 pro formas in a community where nobody has a pro forma. But if you bring in a caterer from 120 miles away because they're the one that gives the receipt, what is the community going to think about how you're supplying your event? So there's lots of those types of pretty basic things. So sorry, I'll just sort of stop there and ignore the slide because I kind of ran off of that.
Thank you very much to our panelists. I'd like to give them a quick round of applause. And thank you to all of you who have shared all of your experiences and lessons of your own. We truly do appreciate it. This is a learning environment at AFP and at this conference, so I appreciate you sharing with us as well. Please.
Can I just say how much I appreciate the way you inverted this whole thing with us at the beginning and you at the end. I know it's a sacrifice for you to do that, but I really appreciate the way you engage us. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Well, and so the next wave, we hope to have, appreciate you writing down your names and contacts. So the next wave will hopefully include following this conversation with us